definition of my idea of critical discourse studies. First of all, the term itself. As you notice, I'm sort of hoping between critical discourse analysis and critical discourse studies. I would like to propose to all of you, if you would like to do that, to use henceforth, as I will do, not the notion of critical discourse analysis, but critical discourse studies. Because critical discourse analysis suggests that it's mostly analysis and not much theory. And I think it's also critical discourse theory which we have to emphasize. So in the same way as we have feminist studies or gender studies and so on, I would like to propose that we henceforth use critical discourse, just a small change of the term critical discourse studies and not critical discourse analysis. Now, what is critical discourse studies all about? As I already said, and also those who presented us here today, it's mostly about power and domination. So one of my main preferred definitions, critical discourse studies, has to do with the discursive reproduction of domination.
I think it's risky classifying too sharply between different approaches, and I would not. I mean, I find it difficult saying what my own approach is because it's changed so much. And I think that the different approaches have fed into each other. So I don't think one can sort of say, you know, there's this approach and that approach and that approach. There are differences, and you know, some of them are clearer than others. Like Turner's, as I've already said, always, as long as I've known him, been focusing on the cognitive interface between the textual and the social. And that's been a distinctive feature of his work. I suppose to some extent in Ruth's work at certain stages. Ruth, on the other hand, I suppose, you know, one notable feature of her work is that she's had a consistent, well, pretty consistently historical approach. So she's tended to collect bodies of material looking at racism that span decades and look at continuities and differences in, say, anti-Semitic discourse. Some people have been more closely attached to systemic functional linguistics, like, I mean, Theo's work came out of that, Theo van Leeuwen's work came out of his own particular adaptation of, and in a sense, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, developing a systemic linguistic type of framework without regard to the orthodoxies of systemic linguistics. So I think his work is regarded as somewhat unorthodox by systemic functional linguists, but nevertheless there's a strong influence from that. And similarly with Gunter Kress and all this linguistics work was very strongly attached to, or drawing upon, the work of Michael Halliday and others in systemic linguistics, which a lot of us have seen as a linguistic theory that has been exceptionally compatible with what we're trying to do, because it was always a socially oriented linguistic theory. It had a strong point of reference outside linguistics itself in the work of Bernstein. It was oriented to text, it was oriented to choice, to the social conditions for choice in text, and in all these ways it was an approach that many critical discourse analysts found very fruitful. But that's much stronger in the work of Theo van Leeuwen and Gunter Kress, to a lesser extent, but still quite a lot in my work. It's not really so strong in the same way, I mean, not really there in Turner's work. Ruth more recently has been more oriented or getting more into a systemic approach. I don't think earlier on she was. So there are these sorts of differences, but also developments in that sort of way.
Different perspectives within CDA, but there are really many, so I wouldn't think of CDA as a kind of well-defined field of study as such. I think it's more a way of thinking about social research in general, and I think I know it's a very loose definition, but I prefer to go for a definition like this rather than treat it already as a normative paradigm that begins there and ends there. So I would say that within that kind of loose frame there are historical and some ethnographic approaches. The work of Ron Scotland, for example, I think is very ethnography based, and the work of Ruth Vodex is sociology based on work on archives and more historical perspective on how we analyze discourse. In the way, and of course, then you have the Van Leeuwen-Kress paradigm that's kind of broadening up the semiotic, the field of semiotic analysis as such. I would say that within that, my own interest falls very much in both epistemological and theoretical questions that are opened up by a view of discourse as it's formulated by Foucault.
I think that discourse analysis can show us the way in which language always is a representation of the world, and the very language used can, and the way in which that language is used can be including some kinds of people, excluding other kinds of people, stigmatizing some kinds of people, privileging other kinds of people. My original work, I think of it sort of as in what I call linguistic anthropology, which is largely, not exclusively, but largely very much connected to American anthropology. I was part of a tradition of people who looked at narrative and conversation, sort of naturally occurring, if you want to put it that way, conversations and narratives, for what they could show about social processes and cultural dynamics. So in some ways my work has always had that sort of empirical orientation, looking at interactive processes starting from conversational exchanges.
I also have been opposed to the idea that discourse analysis reveals things. No? This idea of revealing, I don't like it, because I think that is an idea that is a bit paternalistic, because the analyst seems to have a position, a privileged position, seems to be more aware than speakers, and I reject this idea, and at the same time I think this idea is related with, could give place to new representations, for instance, or new ideologies, which could be also questioned, or we have to bring also into question that. So I prefer this idea of problematization.
It is a sort of founded in a kind of a Marxist approach, which says that the social and economic organization is that which generates the cultural forms. That cultural forms are an outcome of how the society actually is organized. And my attempt was to show how that would actually work out. It's like the kind of medieval master painter who paints the kind of what is it called, the outline of the big painting, and then sets the apprentice to work to color in the toe of the angel or something like that. So I'd seen myself as the person who would color in the toes of the angels, showing how linguistic form actually, how that actually happens, that process, the connection between the linguistic form and the social, and worrying about it and saying, well, what kind of theory do we need in order to do that? And then because of the context in which I work, first of all, media studies and culture studies, saying, well, language alone isn't enough. And attempting to convince my colleagues in the critical discourse sort of field about things like we need a theory of sign, we need a theory of the motivated sign, which rests on the agentive action of individual sign makers. We need to attend to other forms of representation. Remember having arguments with, good-natured arguments, or with Van Dyck, for instance, who thought that ideology rested in language but not in image, for instance, and then, challenged by that to kind of attempt to show how images are ideologically constructed.
And the first thing I've got to say is that I'm not a CDA person. CDA, when you capitalize it, to me means Norman Fairclough and his work and the people who work in his tradition. When you don't capitalize it, just say critical discourse analysis, it means a group of people who I don't see myself always as part of. And the reason is this, is that my argument is that human languages are built in such a way that anytime you express anything, there is always what I call a political aspect. That is, I mean by politics, where situations where social goods are at stake. Things like status or deference or being told that what you did is appropriate or good or bad. Any of that, those things change your standing in social relationships and in groups, and therefore they're social goods. And they're political in the sense that they change our relationships to people and even to institutions. Language cannot help but to express that, right? Because all uses of language are situated in a continuum between trying to express either solidarity with somebody or deference or status with them, or someplace in between. And of course, solidarity and deference or status are social goods. And so any analysis of discourse that is going to be true to what language is will have this political slant in that sense. And so, to me, all discourse analysis is critical discourse analysis in the little c, d, a sense.